Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the somewhat unusual or innovative approaches to working with developing writing tasks that we specialize in here at Landmark College. And before I talk specifically about the kind of manipulatives that I was showed you on this on the previous slide using common construction toys like Legos and Tinker Toys, I want to talk about an approach, a process-based approach to helping students develop and sequence ideas for argument papers, since argument is one of the key kinds of genres that students are expected to write starting in middle school, but certainly in high school. If you're working in a school with the Common Core, you've heard lots and lots about argument and its more persuasive writing and its central place in the writing curriculum. And certainly many college papers are based on some kind of argument or pro-con writing. So a particularly helpful way of breaking down some of the cognitive demands of writing an argument paper have been explored by Patricia Dunn in her wonderful book. I think it's called Walking, Sketching, Talking, and I'll certainly put a reference to that in our resources. She developed something called rhetorical proof cards. And what these are, the process of constructing an argument is very complex and challenging to many students because it requires you to do research, to generate ideas, support, to take a stance, to research a stance, to develop arguments, and then to develop a good amount of supporting corroboration, empirical data, facts, statistics, anecdotes, and so on to back up your claims. So she has developed the rhetorical proof cards for developing argument, which consists of putting the arguments for and against a particular controversial topic. And in this particular case, we're looking at capital punishment. So, an issue that's still very valid and easily arguable from different perspectives. And what she does is she capitalizes on social learning and puts students into teams or groups of 3 or 4, and she gives them each a set of, and I think it's about 20 argument cards. And I have followed her advice and put each argument, or actually it's each support for an argument, on a strip of paper and laminated them so that they can be used and reused. And these have things, they say things like, quote from a member of a murder victim's family saying that an execution will not bring the loved one back. Or, quote from a member of a murder victim's family saying how relieved he is now that his loved one's murderer has been executed. So the students get this bundle of details that support both sides of the argument, and the first thing they need to do is choose a stance, a position, and develop a thesis. They're for or against capital punishment, and then their task is to select from these 20 or so pieces of evidence which ones they think will be the most compelling in establishing their argument, and also which ones they might want to use as counter-arguments to refute, and to sequence them in what they think is the most compelling order. So each team, after each team creates their little bank of arguments for and against and sequences them, then the other teams can actually circulate. So we lay them out on the desk. So we're actually manipulating these arguments, moving them around. And it's certainly much easier to do this on cards like this or post-it notes than it would be if these were just hard text on a page. And then the students can circulate and look at how other people arrange their cards and talk about, well, what do you think is going to be the most compelling argument? Or do we want to start with our strongest argument and then kind of the least effective ones towards the end, or do we want to start with the least compelling and move up to the most compelling to end on a strong point? Do we want to start with an episode or an incident or an anecdote? So it really gives students a lot of opportunity to think collaboratively and to use oral language to talk. So this is another example of using both manipulatives and oral language talk about their ideas to start to structure an argument. And doing this a number of times with different controversial issues really does strengthen students' ability to understand what do we mean by building an argument and building a convincing argument. It gives them practice in developing kind of rhetorical moves. So that's one kind of manipulative. The more common manipulatives are kind of construction toys, and so here's one of my favorite, Klondikers. And we use Legos, Tinker Toys, pipe cleaners, pretty much any construction kit that your kids might have lying around, which has different color parts that lock together or fit together in some way. Pipe cleaners can be twisted together, so they don't have to be interlocking parts, but either different colors or different shapes and sizes of pieces. And basically what we're doing is creating a kind of concrete representation of abstract ideas. And because so many of our students either think in images, pictures, movies, rather than in words, this is a way to tap into their intuitive sense of how ideas fit together and also to generate ideas. And also because many of our students have difficulty focusing on ideas when they're just presented in the abstract and in the ephemeral mode of oral language, giving a concrete form or shape to these ideas that they can move around and manipulate physically, as one of my students said, if I can touch it, it's real, has proved to be a powerful starting point or inroad for a lot of students who struggle to get themselves activated to begin writing, or to, especially that planning stage of digging deep, coming up with the best ideas, and thinking hard about organization. So I wanted to show you a couple of models that my students have built over the years. And this one actually represents a model that a student created not to write, but to study for an exam. And so this represents a tool. They can be used as a tool for comprehension as well as a tool for composition. And so what is this? The back, you can't tell by looking. It looks sort of like a UFO station maybe. But this was a model that a student built in an introductory psych class where they were studying a unit on theories of personality. And they were looking at Freud and Jung and Cole and other theorists of personality. And the student said, there are a lot of theories and a lot of fancy names, and each theory has a lot of parts. I'm getting really confused. I can't remember and keep them straight. So she built herself a set of models. And would anybody like to guess whose theory of personality we have represented here? Might be hard to tell. So after the student creates the model that helps them access their intuitive sense of how ideas relate, the next step really is to have them talk, to attach oral language to it. So in this case, the student said, well, it's Freud's theory of personality. And it's as you can see, it's a tripartite model, and there are 3 levels represented here. And in the bottom level is the id, of course. The snake-like drives and impulses, which we want to keep really kind of hidden in our subconscious most of the time. So the id. In the middle is the ego. It's a fragile ego, and there are 6 interwoven defense mechanisms to protect our fragile ego. So the student said I wove 6 different color pipe cleaners together, and here you can kind of see them, to make a kind of shield around the fragile ego. And then finally, at the very top level, is superego, represented in this case by a pair of, well, it's a little hard to tell, eyeglasses or spectacles, which are looking down on and evaluating and making judgments on your actions and thoughts. Okay, so this is a model used to help students clarify understanding and remember, and especially to distinguish among things that are similar in some ways but different in other ways. Now, in terms of using manipulatives to generate and organize ideas for writing, we've also had a lot of success. And again, often for students who get really wound up in ideas, one of my students said, you know, if I'm really interested in something, I could generate 100 pages of notes about it and never get started. And that's kind of what the student had done originally. Lots of notes, but was not getting started on this paper. It was 2 weeks overdue. She had ideas, but she didn't know how to sort and sequence them. So she built this model, and she came in and said, well, here's my essay. Can I hand this in? We said, no, you still have to do the writing, but I think the hardest part is done. And can anybody guess what kind of an essay this represents? Well, if you guessed compare contrast, that's very good. As the student said, I never realized it's all about parallelism and symmetry. So we've got the red and the green columns, and we've got the kind of this same amount of stuff on each side. And I asked the student to tell me about this model, what it, the thinking that went into this. So she said, okay, so the blue represents my expectations of life at Landmark College, and the red represents the reality. And my first expectation was that I could learn everything all at once in one semester. I was coming here from another college. I needed to work on my writing. Then I'd be out of here, back to Hampshire College. But the reality is I had some other issues I needed to address. So, for instance, time management, in general organization, realizing that I had a lot of executive function challenges before I could begin to approach my writing issues. My second expectation was that it would be impossible to fail, even though I had flunked out of a couple of other colleges up to this time. So I put down a nice solid block of support here. But the reality is, and this is a sloping roof block, you can slide into failure if you don't follow through, if you don't show up to class, if you don't complete your work on time, if you don't meet with your advisor. And then finally, my last expectation was that learning would become easy and automatic. It would be an open window. And the reality is that learning does become easier, but you have to open that window yourself. Nobody's really going to do it for you. So I said, well, that sounds like a pretty coherent essay to me. One of the things we know about either a pictorial, a concept map, or a 3D representation, I call these blueprints for writing, three-dimensional blueprints for writing, is that when we have a picture form of representing information, we can see all of the ideas simultaneously, all at once. But language, and writing in particular, is a highly sequential form of information presentation. So somehow we have to translate between the simultaneous presentation and a highly structured sequential one. And we do that by numbering or talking about how we're going to work our way through the diagram. And so the student said, I'm going to do my first expectation, my first reality, my second expectation, my second reality. I'm doing it point by point. I could have done it block by block. So sometimes this really confuses students, that you can wind your way through a compare contrast two pathways. She could clearly see that this pathway, first A then B, would be more effective. So she said, that's the path I'm going to take. I'm going to add a introduction. I'm going to add a conclusion. Each one of these will be a paragraph I'll develop with anecdotes and examples. And in fact, she was able to write the paper. So I just like to encourage you to try introducing this kind of strategy to your students in a very open-minded, experimental way. It does not work for everybody, but here's an approach that has worked for some students and been very successful.